On today's show, Game 3 awaits for the Atlanta Hawks as they host the Miami Heat on Friday evening. And in advance of that contest, a little bit of a bonus episode here on a Thursday afternoon, talking about some mailbag questions, answering those inquiries, looking at how the Hawks have their chances in this series, and much more coming up.
You are Locked On Hawks, your daily Atlanta Hawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 1225 of the Locked On Hawks podcast. I am your host, Brad Rowland, coming to you on a Thursday afternoon. And thank you for joining us on the podcast today. Please subscribe to the show. Make us your first listen each and every day. Check us out on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, where I am happy to report that as of earlier today on Thursday, we have now reached the benchmark that I've been asking for a while, 1,000 subscribers on YouTube. Thank you for making that happen. If you are a watcher on YouTube or a subscriber there, thank you for your patronage. Also, please do not forget to subscribe on the audio channels as well and help us to support and grow the podcast across the board. This is our fifth podcast of the week. I've been trying to stay busy on this feed, and really this is sort of a bonus episode. It's going to be a little bit shorter than usual, only one break in the middle, and it really is a true bonus podcast. But I had some time on my lunch hour, actually, on this Thursday, and wanted to answer some questions that I got coming in advance of Game 3, because there is that 2-day break in between games. If you missed it this week already, we've done 4 podcasts already. We had Tyler Jones with us. We had a crossover with Wes Goldberg on Wednesday, as well as the game recap podcast from Game 1 and Game 2. So those are still very much in the feeds. Obviously, subscriptions are great, and listens and clicks and all that stuff. And check out those podcasts. But on today's show, basically, it's going to be me and your questions for at least a few minutes here. And we'll start off the podcast with this. So first comes from Alex, who asks, what do you think of the Hawks being this big of an underdog after not even having a home game yet? This is kind of the theme of the podcast today, honestly, but I think the Hawks have a better chance than the market does at this point in time. As of our recording today on Thursday afternoon, our friends at BetOnline, who sponsored this podcast, and they have all the odds that you're looking for, have the Heat at minus 1,800 to win the series. The Hawks at plus 1,000 to win the series. If you were to look at a percentage chance, if you're not a huge bettor, basically that the implied odds of that is something like 94, 95% for Miami. And that's obviously a very high number out of 100. This is not controversial to anyone, but I think even the biggest Hawks homer couldn't say the Hawks are favored in this series right now. I think the Heat clearly should be favored with this 2-0 lead in the series. But with that said, there is some value in my mind on that number alone, to sort of answer the question about that Alex is asking about this, sort of how big the underdog status is right now for the Hawks. Doesn't mean the Hawks are going to win the series, but I think if you just kind of do the math on this, they're going to win it more often than this number indicates in my mind. I think the Hawks have some upside we'll talk about in a second. But basically, the Hawks would have to win this series 9% of the time for this to be valuable, something like that, 10% of the time. And I think they probably do win at least that much, probably more than that. So I think if you're looking at the sort of long term of this, not to go crazy, but I think this is probably a little bit of overstatement towards Miami at this point in time in the market, to answer the question from Alex. This is kind of related. The next question that I'm going to answer here from Darius, who asks, your co-host from the Heat acting like the series is over. That was disappointing in Darius's words to hear. And he asked me, do you agree? I couldn't quite tell. So basically, the short answer is no, I don't agree with that. I think the series is not over at this point in time. Wes Goldberg is the person in question here. I talked to Wes, sort of a crossover episode on Wednesday. He was more the host of that show, and I was kind of the guest along the way. But he's a very smart guy who covers the Heat very well, covered the Warriors before that previously at the highest level as a beat writer, etc. I don't blame him for looking ahead a little bit, because under normal circumstances, the number one seed that wins the first 2 games by 34 points combined is usually a massive favorite in the series. So I kind of get that on his standpoint. And I did make sure to say this on Wednesday's show, and I did that on purpose, but also because I believe it. He sort of implied that it was over, or at least asked me if it was over, and I said immediately the Hawks are not dead in the series, and I believe that. They're not dead in the series. I couldn't pick the Hawks straight up to win the series now, especially with no odds, down 2-0, because just the math of it, you have to win 4 out of 5 games, and at least one of those games has to be on the road that you have to steal here, because the Hawks have maximum 3 home games in this series. But in my mind, I want to be very clear. The Hawks absolutely can still win this series. We have seen crazy things happen with this team. We know the upside of this team as well, Trae Young and the top 3 offense that they have. We saw last year they dug out of some holes along the way in the playoffs and beat some quality opponents, making their run that they made. Part of that is, again, the Hawks have more talent and more experience and really a better number one option than most 8 seeds do. If you just look at history and say, all right, the number 1 seed is up 2-0 in dominant fashion by 34 points combined, obviously most 8 seeds are not going to be even capable, much less will they actually do it, of coming back. But this is the same Hawks core. Obviously, the Capela thing lingers, and we'll come back to that later on in the podcast. But the same, or at least a similar Hawks team that came back in some series last year, came back in some games last year to win big games, upset Philadelphia, etc. So I think this is a better than average number 8 seed for the Hawks. If anything, I think mine might even be a worse than average number 1 seed. That's not to say that they're not a good team, as they are, but certainly a situation where this is not your traditional 2-0 lead for a number 1 versus a number 8. The Hawks have more talent than that and more ability to pull an upset if they were to continue on in this fashion. So hopefully that answers the question. I'm not going to pile on Wes, but certainly he certainly thinks the Heat are going to win the series. I don't blame him for that. But the series is not over in my mind, to answer the question that was asked and also asked on YouTube and other places in the last day or so. Okay, before we get back to the last portion of this podcast with some more mailbag questions and my final thoughts in advance of Game 3, a word from our sponsors on the podcast. Today's show is brought to you by BetOnline. Baseball is in full swing. Of course, the NBA's postseason is actually here as well, with a jam-packed slate of games almost every night for the next couple of months. That includes the Hawks coming up on Friday, of course. And with that in mind, BetOnline.net is the number 1 source for all of your sports betting needs and sports information this year. From all the latest contests, futures, player props, odds across the board, exotics, and much more. BetOnline remains the best spot for all the latest developments in sports, including podcasts and reviews for all of the leagues this season. It's not just basketball or baseball either. They have future bets. They have live betting in your favorite casino games. Football is always on the horizon if you want to look way into the future about the NFL and college football, but also beyond that, they have other sports that includes golf and esports, tennis, horse racing, auto racing, hockey, MMA, boxing, soccer, cricket even, entertainment bets, and much more. And really, there are always something to bet on at betonline.net. Head to the website right now or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and the action across the sports world today. BetOnline, where the game starts. Today's show is also brought to you by Built Bar. And as I've been saying for a while now, I had a goal this year to eat better. And really the biggest success along the way is the fact that I've been eating Built Bars and really having a lot of success overall as a result of it. In some ways, it's actually a lot easier for me because I actually enjoy eating Built Bar. From the protein-infused puff bars that are fantastic, all the other fan favorites from Built Bar, each and every bar has 100% real chocolate. It makes a huge difference, and they taste absolutely fantastic. On top of the taste, Built Bar is really healthy for you. They have low calorie counts. They have high protein. You can easily replace your candy bars with Built Bars this season, both in taste and to improve your nutrition overall. And Built.com has all the answers that you're looking for at this point in time. You won't believe what you see. In fact, most Built Bars have only 4 grams of sugar, 4 net carbs, and 17 grams of protein with that very low calorie count that I mentioned earlier. Built Bar also has longtime flavors like coconut almond, lemon almond cheesecake, cookies and cream, and more. And new flavors coming all the time. Plus, each and every one is really delicious. I've tried them all at this stage, and they're really awesome across the board. Even if you have your personal favorites, you cannot go wrong with any kind of Built Bar. That's why check out Built Bars. You go to Built.com right now. Use promo code LOCK15 when you get there. If you do that, 15% off on your order with Built Bar. That's promo code LOCK15, 15% off at Built.com. All right, and the next question I want to answer on this podcast comes from Tom, who asks, what do you think is the biggest swing factor for Game 3 in particular? And a couple questions that I got were kind of like this, and a couple were about Capela. So I'm actually going to combine them a little bit because Capela's status, as I'm recording this, is still up in the air. I'm recording this pre-injury report. My apologies. It's my best window to record. I don't think he's going to play on Friday, if I had to guess. Travis Schlenk, as a reminder, earlier this week on the radio said that the Hawks were going to reevaluate Capela on Friday. Reevaluation does not mean return. And basically, it would surprise me if they reevaluated him on the same day as Game 3 and he was able to actually play in Game 3. He's not been ruled out. I want to stress that as I'm recording this, but if I had to guess, he's not going to play on Friday. And we'll see how he's even listed on the injury report as of Thursday evening. I'll tweet that out when I have that information on Thursday. But I think his absence in this series has actually been under-discussed so far, particularly nationally. Even with Collins, I should say, especially with Collins in the limited state that he's in, he's been playing, he's been a positive factor in the series, but Collins, we can all agree, is not his normal self right now. And with that in mind, Capela would have been their second best player in the series. I think Capela's been their second best player for most of the season, behind Trae, of course. And if nothing else, he is very clearly the centerpiece of this defense. He's also their primary role threat in terms of like as a pick and roll guy. Obviously, Collins is great at doing that as well, but Capela puts pressure on the rim. Free throw shooting, not always a strength. Finishing around the rim, not always a strength right now as in terms of non-dunks. But he's a positive offensive player as well in my mind because of the pressure he puts on at times. So his absence makes life harder for the Hawks on both ends of the floor. And I think if he was more famous or whatever, it might get more attention. But one team is healthy in the series, and it's not the Hawks. Miami has their core guys, and the Hawks are missing. Conservatively, we'll say, even if you are not a big Capela fan, top 3 or 4 player on the Hawks roster, I would say they're number 2 player right now, and with the state that Collins is in. So that's a huge absence that cannot be overstated. So with that said, I think the Hawks defense was actually pretty reasonable, as I talked about after game 2. They played pretty well in that game, at least all things considered, all the factors in play. The problem being that Butler went crazy, and that is obviously something they can't overcome because Butler was just really awesome in game 2. But for me, the biggest swing, to answer the question more specifically in my mind for game 3, is probably how Trae Young plays. That's kind of a broad swing piece, but the path for the Hawks to win this series as an underdog without home court against number 1 seed kind of always had to include Trae being the best player on the floor in the series. And through 2 games, he has not been the best player on the floor. I thought he was better in certain ways in game 2, but still had a ton of turnovers, some bad decision-making, etc. He was more comfortable as a scorer in that game for sure. But I think objectively, no one would say he's been the best player through 2 games in the series. I think the Hawks need to have Trae be his best self, or at least something close to that, for the majority of the rest of the series to have a chance to win and come back to win 4 out of the next 5 games. That applies to game 3 as well, in particular, to answer the question. But a step deeper than that, if you want to go beyond Trae, my answer would be the Hawks have to take care of the ball in game 3 and keep Miami out of fast break opportunities on the other end of the floor as a result. If you look at the numbers, I talked about this a lot in game 2, but even the eye test, the Heat are just not that good in half-court offense this year. They've been better in the series, but they've been middling. They're not terrible, but they're like middle of the pack in half-court offense for the season. And the Hawks have been at least frisky defensively. But Miami is excellent in transition, and they have been all year long. There are some advantages, especially Miami might have without Capela in scoring in the half court. But part of the Hawks having the number 2 offense in the league, and again, number 2 in the league in offense this year, was that the Hawks basically never turned the ball over. They were number 1 in the NBA in turnover rate this year. Also turnovers per game, live ball turnovers, they were top 5, etc. But through 2 games, they have struggled to take care of the ball, which cannot happen. The Hawks are not the same team if they turn the ball over a lot. And if they can hold that down to like 10 or 12 or even less than that turnovers in game 3, that means getting more shots up. And that is usually a positive sign, sort of boost your efficiency overall. So the runner-up to all this might just be that Jimmy Butler can't be making jump shots, because if he makes jump shots, as we saw in game 2, it's kind of lights out. The Hawks don't have the greatest personnel to defend Jimmy Butler at this point in time. And on the positive side, Jimmy's not been a great shooter this year, but he's been making shots through 2 games, and that makes Miami a lot more difficult to guard. So I would say, broadly speaking, Trae's got to be better. Also, the Hawks just cannot afford to turn the ball over like they did in game 2. Okay. Last sort of broad question here that I'll answer comes from Jacob, who just says, can the Hawks still win the series? And if so, do they have to win game 3 to actually win this series? The short answer I would say is yes. I believe the Hawks can win the series if they put together their A game, particularly on offense, and put some pressure back on Miami to keep up with that, because the Hawks are the better offensive team in this series. That's as funny as that might sound after watching these 2 games. The Hawks are pretty clearly better on offense than the Heat are. Now, defensively, the Heat are miles ahead of the Hawks. That's just the reality of the situation. Miami's awesome defensively, particularly in the playoffs, and the Hawks are better in the playoffs than they've been in the regular season, but still not great defensively, especially without Capela. Take him off the team. I can't imagine how bad the Hawks would have been for this season. So our friends at BetOnline, just for some context, make the Hawks right now, as of Thursday midday, a 1.5-point underdog in game 3 at home. That is close to a coin flip, and obviously the series changes tone quite a bit if the Hawks were to win on Friday. I don't want to make too much out of it, because I'm not someone, if you listen to this podcast all the time, you probably know this, but I'm not someone that talks about must wins or like puts too much pressure on one game individually. But the reality is, if the Hawks go down 0-3, they are not drawing dead, but they certainly have the uphill climb of all uphill climbs, down 3-0, having to win 4 games in a row. That would be extremely difficult. If they were to win game 3, it's a new series, because as many pointed out, and I'm not sure I've said it even as plainly as this on the podcast so far, but the road team has not won a game in this series. Now, the Hawks don't have home court, so they have to actually win a road game in this series to win it. plus all their home games. Probably is the sort of traditional route that they would probably have to take in this series. But I do think that some of the sort of the door slamming on this series has been a little bit overdone, in part because the Hawks have not been at home yet, and famously they are 20-3 in their last 23 games in their home building. The crowd will be big on Friday night. I am sure of it. So I think it's appropriate to say that, like, yes, the Hawks are a small underdog in the betting market on Friday night. I think the Hawks, I'd probably have the Hawks as a small favorite if it was me. Is sort of evaluating that game. Not a huge favorite by any means, because Miami is still a really good team, but the Hawks playing as well as they have at home recently, the entire series can swing in terms of perception and just even in the reality on game 3. So do they have to win game 3 to win the series? I mean, I'm not someone that ever says things like in extremely plain terms. Like I won't ever say this is like the series is over if they lose. But again, undeniably, the Hawks go from having a real puncher's chance in the series if they win if they win in game 3 and kind of level it out a little bit, get some confidence. If they lose game 3, I have a hard time believing the Hawks are going to win the series. I will never say ever that the series is over after 3 games. But if it's 3-0, then obviously that challenge sort of speaks for itself. So it's a big game. It's obviously as close to a must-win as you can get this season. I kind of have scoffed and kind of poked fun at it a little bit during the regular season in particular, of like must-win scenarios, stuff like that. There's almost never a must-win in the regular season, almost never, especially once it's like game 82 and you have to win to get in the playoffs. But in a playoff series, when you lose the first 2 games and come home for game 3, it's a virtual must-win. That's for sure. So we'll have full coverage of that game. I think the Hawks should probably feel pretty good about that game, to be honest with you, in their home building. They've been playing so well there, and not to make too much of it, but if Trae's good, they can beat anybody on any night, and we'll see how they fare in that spot. That'll do it for today's podcast. I know a little bit shorter than usual. My apologies for that, but I want to give you a little bit of extra content. This is the 5th show in, I think, 4 days at this point in time. And our 6th show of the week will be after the game on Friday. So please subscribe to the podcast. I'll be back as soon as I can after the game on Friday. It's a home game, so I'll be in the building for that one. But we'll have full coverage after the game as always. Tell a friend about the show. That really helps us to grow the podcast as well, especially in the middle of the playoffs when more people are dialed in than usual. Follow us on Twitter at LockedOnHawks. Follow me on Twitter at BT Rowland, and we'll see you after the game on Friday.